what is at the time thought to have been a patchwork of tropical islands and lagoons. It is the latest dinosaur track to be revealed at the quarry, which has been described as one of the world's most significant dinosaur superhighways. Well, astonishing pictures. We're about to take a short break. When we're back, we're going to spend the next 30 minutes answering some of your questions on the Middle East. After that, Gaza peace plan, phase 1 yesterday. But we will be joined here by a range of BBC correspondents to take us through some of the answers to the questions that you have sent in. A host of questions. I've got them here on a range of different topics. So for the next 30 minutes, we will attempt to answer those questions. Let me show you some of the pictures, though, that have come in today. Just the scale of the destruction in Gaza, because these from a drone giving you just an idea of what is left in the Gaza Strip. I'm back in just a moment or two. Hello and welcome to Your Voice, Your BBC News. We've had an avalanche of questions about the extraordinary events in the Middle East. If yesterday was phase one, what actually happens next? Well, with me to answer your questions are Barbara Plett-Usher in Jerusalem. We'll also be joined by Rushdie Abu-Alouf, who's our Gaza correspondent. And I'm also joined by Frank Gardner, the BBC's security correspondent. So let's get cracking. And I'm going to ask you all the same question first of all, because a quick thought after yesterday's extraordinary scenes in terms of taking stock of where we are. Barbara, to you first of all.
A truly momentous day. Great joy and hope on both sides, also continued pain on both sides. But today is the day after. Very much a lot of questions. Now, all the questions that have to be answered in terms of whether this can last are coming to the fore.
Frank, your assessment of where we are.
I think we're in a very fragile place, both short-term and long-term. The initial signs are not particularly encouraging. 7 Palestinians have been shot dead by Israelis on the edge, the yellow line that Israeli forces withdrew to. There's been some clashes inside Gaza, and at the same time, not all the dead hostage bodies have been returned, which has annoyed Israel.
Barbara, let me turn to the first of the questions that have come in from Pat, because they ask if the remaining deceased Israeli hostages that Frank was just alluding to can't be found in a certain time frame, could that cause a fundamental problem to this deal?
Yes, it could. It's the first big test in a way, because this was supposed to be what would get it started. All the hostages returned, and we don't have all the hostages returned. Only 4 of the dead bodies returned. Now, having said that, there was a recognition from the beginning, and it's written into the agreement, that they probably wouldn't all be able to come back right away because Hamas doesn't know where all of them are. They're buried under the rubble of Gaza, some of them, and it would take longer than that, than one day or a few days to find them. And there is a task force set up by the agreement, which includes people from Qatar and the U.S. and Turkey, and also the International Red Cross, to follow this up with the kind of funding and technical support that is necessary. But we understand that during the negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh, Hamas indicated it had more bodies than 4, around 12, I think, and it didn't hand them all back. So why didn't it hand them back? Is it holding some back as leverage for how the second phase proceeds? I think that's very much the Israeli government suspicion. You've had some strong statements from Israeli government officials, and you also have reporting now in the Israeli media that the defense establishment is recommending that there's a holdback on aid, for example, not allowing the full flow of aid until it's clear that the bodies will be returned. So I think this could be very much a pressure point or an inflection point as to where the difficulties begin with the agreement implementation.
Barbara, I'll be back to you in a moment, but let me bring in Rushdie Abu-Alouf, our Gaza correspondent. Rushdie, I'll ask you too about aid in a moment, but give me an idea of what is actually happening on the ground in areas of Gaza from the people you've been talking to through the course of the last 24 hours.
Well, there is two images today in Gaza. Well, image of people continue celebrating the release of the hostages yesterday, and this afternoon about 45 bodies for Palestinians killed during the war and taken by the Israeli army has been returned into Nasser Hospital. Well, there is a real issue here because in Gaza there is no facility that can make the necessary test. There is no DNA lab to identify those people, and we don't know how they are going to handle it with the relative. There is 9,000 Palestinians are missing during the war. The other story in Gaza today is the Hamas continue to clash with Palestinian clans and Palestinian gangs groups in east of Gaza City in Shijaiya area. Well, Hamas said that they are going after criminal active people who were committed crime during the war, and also those who are collaborating with Israel. But this is ringing the bell for most of the people in Gaza that internal fighting might come back in the same force like they have experienced back in 2007 when there was Gaza was very close to a civil war.
There's a question that's been sent in. It is a simple question. Where are we in terms of any sort of time frame, or how are we done in terms of disarming Hamas? Rushdie, that question to you.
Well, Hamas, during the negotiation in Sharm el-Sheikh, they said that they have about 12 bodies that are identified that they can hand them over. That's according to a Palestinian official who was following the negotiation. The handing over 4 bodies yesterday was a surprise for everybody, and there is people are very skeptical about this. They believe that maybe Hamas want to make some leverage or wait to see how Israel will behave. And then they can hand over the bodies. Hamas officially said that they are unable to find all of the bodies because of lack of equipment. And they said they need advanced equipment to dig under the rubble and make the proper test to understand, to be able to hand over all of the 24 remaining bodies in Gaza. And this might take a very long time. And we have seen Israel's reaction today was very quickly by stopping the decision to open Rafah crossing tomorrow, which will not be open on both sides. It will only be open to allow hundreds of Palestinian sick and injured people to go. The WHO said about 15,000 people need urgent medical care outside Gaza. They were hoping that the crossing would be open tomorrow. Well, until now, it is very, very complicated, and this is what making the people of Gaza are really worried that if this delay for a long time, a ceasefire would collapse.
Barbara, let me ask you a question related to the disarmament of Hamas. What sense do you get of how long the Israeli government is going to give that particular aspect? So you were talking about the return of all of the dead bodies, but in terms of any sort of timeline that the Israeli government is talking about when it comes to disarmament, what sense do you get?
Well, there isn't one, Matthew. There isn't a timeline for disarmament, and there isn't one in the agreement. In fact, there are very, very few, if any, details in the agreement. It's just sort of aspirations or statements of principle, and so that is one of the difficulties now in figuring it out. It is something they're looking at very closely, the disarmament of Hamas and the demilitarization of Gaza. Hamas has always said that it would only disarm when it could hand its weapons over to a Palestinian state. I haven't seen anything since the agreement that has contradicted that. And as Rushdie was saying, what we're seeing instead is that the Hamas has taken over security control of the part of Gaza from which Israel has withdrawn, not to turn its guns against Israel, but to assert its control against rival clans and rival gangs, which has created quite a bit of civil conflict in that part of Gaza. The plan says that this should be taken over by an international stabilization force made up of soldiers from the Arab countries and from Turkey, and they are supposed to be working alongside Palestinian police, and the Egyptians are going to be working at training those Palestinian police. But it's difficult to see, it really depends on how Hamas proceeds here, because it's difficult to see the Arabs entering Gaza and they're not going to fight Hamas. So this is all a bit unclear now in terms of if things will go forward, but the Israelis will certainly be keeping a close eye on it. They have not indicated any timeline, though.
Frank, exactly on that point, Donald Trump on Air Force One said that phase 2 had already started. I mean, some of the things he's been saying, of course, need clearly to be checked with the reality on the ground. But in terms of that stabilisation force, what do we expect in the coming weeks and months?
Well, it's very nascent, as Barbara mentioned there. This is early days. The notion is that Muslim majority countries such as Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, possibly the Emirates, maybe Indonesia, would contribute troops, but only to a stabilization force. They are not going to go in there and forcibly disarm Hamas fighters who are, battle hardened after all these months. And that's not going to be a very big force. There will be something called a CMCC, a Civil Military Coordination Center, that's going to be based at Ashdod, just north of the Gaza Strip. And there will be around 200 US logistic troops who are not going to go into Gaza. And by the way, there are going to be no British troops going into Gaza. There is no plan for that, because Britain obviously has a colonial past in this part of the world that it doesn't wish to repeat. So the logistic troops are going to help coordinate it all, but it's still very unclear. It's very vague. So yesterday's razzmatazz in Sharm el-Sheikh was really about optics and about celebrating the fact that at least they'd got to phase one. Hostages out, detainees out of Israeli jails, but that's kind of it for the moment.
Let me go back to Rushdie and ask the questions around that critical area of humanitarian aid. How much, Rushdie, is getting in and how is it being distributed?
Well, some was distributed yesterday, others were looted. About 20 trucks were looted within an area under Israeli security control that Hamas security forces can't access, and there was no way to secure these trucks, and it was looted by thousands of people. We understand that about 600 trucks were entered yesterday, including for the first time 30 trucks carrying cooking gas and fuel for the hospitals. And even with 2-3 days of flow of aid, it's not near enough. You know, Gaza, according to the UN agencies, they need 600 trucks every day for at least 2 months to overcome the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Also, some trucks were allowed for the traders and vendors to buy from Israel. So the prices in the market was dropped really significant in the last couple of days. Like, for example, 1 kilo of flour used to cost £15 about 3-4 weeks ago, and now it cost £1 yesterday in the streets, because the traders were also having a big quantity of food and cooking oil and flour, sugar in their warehouses that they were keeping them to sell them for the higher price. And now, since there is a ceasefire, hundreds of trucks were deployed in the markets, and we have seen images of active people in the markets. But the people who can't afford buying things, and this is the majority of the people, are relying on aid. This is a very upsetting news for them. Reducing what is already not enough is really a disaster for them.
Barbara, a follow-up question on aid, because, of course, for such a long time, Israel denied it was actually blocking aid getting in. How are they explaining that it is now flowing into the Gaza Strip?
Well, they're not really saying very much about it, actually, Matthew. I mean, their position is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has always completely insisted that there are no restrictions on aid, and that would still be what they say. There is a ceasefire, so there aren't security obstacles. There's not military fighting anymore. So presumably that would be the reason for the full flow of aid. But the UN has consistently said it's not just security obstacles, it's also bureaucratic obstacles, it's delays, it's goods that have been blocked, lists of things that they were not able to bring in. The aid, the picture of aid had been shifting a bit before the ceasefire. So the Israelis had gone into that big offensive in Gaza City. They had completely cut off aid there. They'd closed the crossing point in the north, so aid wasn't getting in there. That was to try and force the Palestinians down south. But in the south, there was a bit more aid getting in. It had started to increase. So that was already happening. And there is another element here, which is, you remember that that was already happening, I should say, especially since the declaration of famine had been made in August. And there was that other element as well, Matthew. Remember that the Israelis had accused the UN of being an obstacle, basically saying that they were allowing Hamas to sort of steal aid from their stores, although no sort of clear evidence or convincing evidence of systematic stealing was presented, and they brought up this alternative model, which was the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, set up by sponsored by the Israelis or backed by the Israelis and the Americans, which had these aid hubs in military zones, which meant that a lot of Palestinians got killed when they were trying to get aid. So that has quietly gone away. We don't hear anything about it now. It seems they've packed up and gone away, and the UN is back in control of the distribution of aid. So that seems to be at least a tacit admission that system failed.
Frank, a question about the running of Gaza. At what stage will Palestinians be actually running the Gaza Strip?
So the idea is that the Palestinian Authority will need to undergo quite a lot of reforms, because it's fairly discredited in the eyes of many Palestinians. I mean, one of the reasons why Hamas came to power in the first place in 2007 is that they won the elections in Gaza. They're not in power in the West Bank, although they've got a lot of supporters there. So there's a lot of reforms that have got to take place. And I don't know who is going to make this decision, presumably this so-called Board of Peace. And it's, it's all a bit vague, frankly, but the idea is at the top of that will be President Trump, if you can keep him engaged in all of this, alongside Abdel Fattah Sisi, the Egyptian president, and various other figures. Sir Tony Blair is one that we've heard mentioned. And when they decide that the Palestinian Authority is ready, or when everybody agrees that they're ready to take over, that's the plan. But it's still very murky. And before then, there's a lot of security issues in Gaza itself.
You touched on Donald Trump, and we have a question here, so I'll come to it straight away with you. It is one of the crucial questions in the months ahead, is how Donald Trump remains engaged in this or not, because it is entirely possible he could think hostages are out, job done, and there are so many crucial elements to this that remain slightly grey to be worked out, really important elements, and it is critical he does remain engaged.
Do you know, Matthew, you and I have been doing this job for long enough that you will probably remember the days of Sharm el-Sheikh summits with President Clinton. I used to go down there to Sharm el-Sheikh, I think Barbara did as well, and I remember Clinton had an absolutely forensic grasp of the details of the Palestinian-Israeli situation. He knew where all the settlements were. He knew the UN Security Council resolutions. He didn't need autocue. He knew he was in charge of the detail. Donald Trump is not a details guy. He's a deals guy. He leaves the details to other people, and he likes to be able to say, job done. He's been arguing on the plane with correspondents about, whether it was perhaps a little premature to say the war is over. It's a ceasefire. It's not a comprehensive peace deal. And this isn't peace in the Middle East, which, that's an aspiration, a very good one, a noble aspiration, but this isn't the final peace deal. The Palestinians are nowhere near getting a state of their own. There is nowhere near an agreed structure as who is going to govern Gaza.
And of course, all of those questions, or so many of those questions, come back to the muscle that the US president can give. Let me go back to Rushdie, because we've had some of the latest drone imagery from over the Gaza Strip, just showing the catastrophic destruction that has been just meted out over the last couple of years. In terms of what people are saying to you about what they are returning to, just tell me some of the conversations you've had.
Well, total devastation. We're talking to my family members, my friends, close people that I know. Over 100 people I've been receiving pictures from them, that all of them our houses were destroyed. There is very small area in the middle of Gaza, a Rimal neighborhood, that is almost untouched, where about maybe 100,000 people, which is 10% of the population of Gaza, are having houses. So about 90% of Gaza is the biggest city. It's the capital for the Gaza Strip, is completely destroyed. There is no functioning hospital, no functioning banks, schools, universities, roads, infrastructure to everything, to water, clean water, electricity, everything is destroyed. I spoke to someone which I know very well. He used to have a four-story building to him and his 4 brothers. Each one has a flat on it. And now they are all living in a camp in Khan Yunis. And when I did ask him, well, the road is open, why you didn't go back? He said, well, there is nothing left in Gaza, so I can go back to all of my buildings. And he sent me, photos to the building. It's completely destroyed. And he said, even if I want to put a tents over the building, it won't fit, because we are big 5 families and the space is small. So he rather stay in a camp in Khan Yunis rather than going back to his homes. And number 2, he said, I can't trust the ceasefire, because we were back to our homes back in January, and we were forced to leave during the Israeli fighting, and we can't trust that this ceasefire will hold.
Rushdie, as you were speaking, Frank was nodding along and wanted to come in.
Yeah, just a point on that. So Halo Trust, which is the mine clearing and explosive ordnance clearing company, UK-based, tell me that they reckon of all the ordnance, all the munitions dropped on Gaza in the last 2 years, 10%, up to 10%, might well be unexploded. So that means that the business of clearing the rubble, of getting, exposing all of this rubble is going to be incredibly hazardous. So there's an enormous risk to people as they search for the remains of loved ones and through the ruins of their houses that they are going to come across unexploded bombs and other munitions.
We've only got about 5 minutes left.
Well, it happened yesterday, yeah.
Brief answers now to a number of questions I still have to get through. Barbara, to you first of all, because Brian asks, will Benjamin Netanyahu be arrested for war crimes? There are still outstanding indictments from the ICJ and ICC.
So nothing happens to those indictments legally or judicially. They're about crimes that allegedly have been committed. They're not about a peace deal that might happen. Perhaps there would be a political dividend if Mr. Netanyahu is seen to be implementing the peace deal. There might be a political will not to arrest him if he lands on the soil of member states. That's their obligation. Perhaps there might be an international push to get charges dropped if there is in fact a peace deal, but that would be a political issue, not a legal one.
Frank, a brief thought on this, because there are so many potential avenues in what lies ahead. If this holds, could we see a scenario where Israel adopts a sort of Lebanon strategy? So a deal has been signed, but sporadically there are huge strikes, aren't there?
I think a lot depends on if there are any cross-border raids by Hamas or any other militant groups, and whether Israel considers that that border is safe. With Lebanon, they have gone in there after the peace deal, and Israel keeps saying that they're finding caches of weapons and so on. So it's not as dangerous as it was up there, but it's certainly not quiet. And I don't think it's going to be completely quiet until there is a Palestinian state.
Rushdie, back to you, and another question, and this is linked to the 154 Palestinian detainees who've been deported to Egypt. Tell me more about and the legality of that.
Well, I'm not sure about the legality, but Israel have done that for a very long time. Since the beginning of the first Intifada back in the 80s, they used to deport people to Egypt and other countries. And during this deal, about 56 people are in Egypt. Now they will be distributed into 5 different countries, including Turkey here and Qatar. Well, Qatar, when I went to see Hamas in Qatar many times, there is always Palestinian freed prisoners living in Qatar, even from the Shalit deal back in 2012. So Israel have done this quite a lot of time before, and now what is happening is that their family, like immediate family, their husband, their wives, their kids, already traveled to Egypt yesterday, and they were reunited at the Egyptian soil. But it is very difficult for someone is being in the prison for 25 years. And suddenly he's not allowed to go back to his home, and he has to live his entire life outside his country.
Barbara, a question from Hannah, who said, I wondered what had happened to the young, emaciated man, the hostage, Eviatar David, who was shown in that propaganda video. Did he survive? Did he return to Israel?
Yes, he did. That propaganda video, of course, showing him in a tunnel, apparently being told to dig his own grave, and him saying that he hadn't eaten for days, he barely had any water, totally horrified Israelis, and strong condemnations from Israel and other countries. He has come back, very thin, very pale, but walking, seemed to be in very good spirits as he greeted his family members. And also, he was released, he was reunited with his childhood friend. They had both been kidnapped at the Nova Music Festival and spent much of their captivity together, but then they had been separated. And there's a wonderful video where you see them rushing into each other's arms, almost like tackling each other, not letting each other go. So he is very much alive. He is very much back.
Barbara, thank you. Frank, a final question. David asks, when will journalists be let in? Interesting, back on Thursday, the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu's spokeswoman, saying that journalists absolutely already are in Gaza. That is not correct, is it?
No, international journalists have not been allowed into Gaza, and there is a huge mounting pressure from not just the BBC, but a lot of news agencies and news media organisations here in the UK to get into Gaza so that the media can report with their own eyes. Now, I want to pay enormous tribute to the very brave journalists, Palestinian journalists, who have reported from Gaza, often at great risk themselves, Rushdie Abu Aloup being one himself, and his colleagues. It's dangerous stuff, but the excuse given by the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, that it's too dangerous for them to get in, that's for journalists themselves and their organizations to take that decision. So, you know, we go to places like Ukraine, to Somalia. Barbara's been in Sudan. You know, that's really not up to... I think the media organizations can take that decision themselves.
Frank, we have to leave it there. Thanks so much. That is all we have time for. My thanks to Barbara, to Rushdie and to Frank, and thanks to all of you who sent questions in. Head to the BBC website to keep right up to date. But that's it from me. Thanks for being with us. Live from London, this is BBC News. Uncertainty over the Gaza peace plan as Israel names 2 of the 4 dead hostages returned. Anger grows that 24 others have not been handed over. Renewed gunfire on the streets of Gaza with reports of public executions of Palestinians by masked Hamas fighters. New footage of the scale of the destruction. The UN says 80% of all of the buildings in the Gaza Strip have been destroyed or damaged. Our other headlines. The French Prime Minister backs down on his government's key pension reforms, which raise the retirement age to 64.
Our pension and the reform of our pension will be at the heart of the debate of the next presidential election.
And celebrations across Cape Verde as it becomes the second smallest nation ever to reach the World Cup finals. Hello and welcome to today's Verified Live. There's uncertainty over the future of Gaza the day after a huge breakthrough which saw Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners and detainees released in a ceasefire agreement. There are reports of Hamas gunmen carrying out executions, and the Palestinian Civil Defence has told the BBC that 7 people were killed by Israeli forces in 2 separate incidents in the Gaza Strip. Well, Israel has now confirmed the identity of 4 bodies of hostages that were handed over yesterday. The Red Cross says recovering the remains of the other deceased hostages will be a massive challenge amid the Gaza rubble. Well, the scale of the damage in Gaza is becoming clearer. A UN development team estimates that more than 80% of all the buildings in the Gaza Strip have been destroyed or damaged. These are some of the very latest drone pictures. A warning that this report from our Middle East correspondent Yolande Knell contains upsetting images.
Hailing the start of a golden age, President Trump ended a remarkable day trip in the Middle East, but his peace plan is short on key details.
What's the road ahead for governing Gaza? Because
a lot of people like the one-state solution, some people like the two-state solutions. We'll have to see.
But now, far from disarming and giving up power as the plan demands, Hamas is asserting its authority over Gaza's ruins. Today, this was a deadly shootout with its rivals in an armed gang. Earlier, others were executed by Hamas gunmen in this verified video. Since the ceasefire, there's been a promised surge in vital aid getting into the Strip: food, medicines, tents and fuel. UN workers have rushed to restore water supplies for people returning to Gaza City.
They want to begin that long process of rebuilding and restarting their lives, but to do that they need water. Everywhere we went yesterday, driving around, assessing the situation and meeting families, people were doing that universal sign for please give me a drink.
The UN says 80% of all buildings in Gaza are destroyed or damaged, over 90% in Gaza City. For 2 million Palestinians living here, the stakes could not be higher, and many are desperately hoping that crucial talks will soon start on the next steps for peace.
I support any effort that leads to security and stability and revives the economy just to give people comfort. Any effort, even if it is a small hope, God willing, it will grow in the future, because we are exhausted and we want to raise our children.
But there's so much that can derail this deal. Israelis accuse Hamas of breaking the initial agreement after it sent back the bodies of only 4 deceased hostages instead of all 28.
It's like the soul being taken as well from us as families. We've been kidnapped as families. So that's why this closure is so important. We cannot pass into the path of rebuilding Gaza, going to phase 2, phase 3 in the Trump framework until we have all our beloved ones back.
Now, with the US president back at the White House, there's a danger that his attention moves on. Just as crucial decisions must be made for any real chance of peace in the Middle East. Yolande Knell, BBC News, Jerusalem.
Well, let's speak live to the former hostage negotiator and peace activist Gershon Baskin, joining us live from Jerusalem, and we're very glad to have you here on the programme. I just wanted for you to reflect, first of all, on yesterday, because you have spent decades securing hostage releases. What were your overriding emotions yesterday?
Well, the whole country was in joy yesterday. Every single Israeli was filled with joy and tears of joy as we witnessed on television the returning of each one of the hostages coming home, 20 people who were rejoined with their families after a horrible 2-year period of not knowing if they were even going to make it out of Gaza alive. On the other hand, as your report noted, there are 28 families who are waiting for their deceased loved ones to be returned. Only 4 of the 28 came home. And now we're in a deep crisis mode because each side is accusing the other of breaching the agreement. And the Americans are committed to keeping this being an end of war agreement and not a temporary ceasefire. There's a lot of work to do, and we can't allow this agreement to collapse so soon.
Yes.
We can't allow it to collapse at all.
So how big a problem is it that those 24 bodies still have not been handed over? How big a problem is that now?
Well, it's a very big problem because there's zero trust. So the Israelis believe that Hamas is playing games. Hamas is accusing Israel of breaching the agreement by killing people in Gaza. The reality on the ground is that it's very difficult to locate the bodies. Many of the Hamas commanders who were holding the bodies, who had buried the bodies, have been killed by Israel. As your report noted, 80% of the buildings in Gaza have been destroyed in part or in full. There are a few thousand Gazans who are unaccounted for being buried underneath the rubble of buildings. And it's very likely that there might be Israeli hostages who are buried underneath the rubble. So we may not get all the buildings. The agreement did create an international mechanism involving Egypt, Turkey, and Qatar to ensure that Hamas is doing everything possible to return the bodies. And I understand the Egyptians went into Gaza today. I also understand that the Israelis have some intelligence information about the whereabouts of bodies, and they have yet to share that with the Egyptians, who could share it with Hamas. Yeah. And I think I just put that into motion before we started this talk.
A brief answer to this question, because this was supposed to happen yesterday. Did Hamas not know that they wouldn't be able to locate all of those bodies? Because those families, you will have seen it, were there waiting, thinking it was going to happen.
Right. I'm pretty sure that Hamas knew they would have difficulty locating all the bodies. I think the Hamas leadership outside wasn't aware that they had so few bodies where they knew exactly where they were, and that was why only 4 were returned yesterday. This is an issue which is going to continue to be on the table until it is resolved.
You've worked so closely over these last 2 years. When you look at the deal that was finally agreed and materialised, how close was this deal to the one that was on the table with Joe Biden?
It was pretty close. The big difference was that Donald Trump was in the room, and Donald Trump had decided that it was time for the war to end, and Donald Trump made the war end. Without him, it wouldn't have ended.
How important, and we're looking at the pictures on the screen, because when Joe Biden was trying to actually get this over the line, Donald Trump met Benjamin Netanyahu at Mar-a-Lago. How important was that meeting in terms of what then ensued over the coming months?
Look, Biden was negotiating a partial agreement for a temporary ceasefire and a return of only part of the portion of the hostages. My claim against the Biden negotiating position was that there was no reason they should negotiate the end of the war and the return of all the hostages. And I brought a deal in September of 2024 in which Hamas agreed to exactly that over a 3-week period to return all the hostages and to end the war. But the Israeli side wouldn't agree to it. It was only Trump's intervention that brought the first ceasefire that went into power on the 19th of January, the day before Trump entered the White House. And it was only after the failed Israeli assassination attempt in Doha that Trump decided that the war had to come to an end.
So a final thought, when you look at the longer view, there are obvious pitfalls in the near future, and you touched upon a few, but what will it take, do you think, to make this peace permanent?
Well, let's face the reality that this is not Israeli-Palestinian peace. This is an ending of the war in Gaza and a beginning of a process of rebuilding Gaza. The Americans will be going to the Security Council next week to pass a resolution in the Security Council which will embody this agreement within the framework of the UN Security Council, a resolution that will provide the mandate for a multinational force to come to Gaza. We need to see the establishment of a new Palestinian government in Gaza and a Palestinian security force being established, which is not Hamas. There are a lot of moving parts here and a lot of things that have to happen immediately in order for this not to spin out of control.
Gershon Baskin, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining us here on today's Verified Live. Well, let's continue with this because Hamas has deployed gunmen and police across the Gaza Strip in recent days, saying it is preventing a security vacuum. But today there have been more deadly gun battles with its rivals in armed gangs. Well, Merlin Thomas from BBC Verify spoke to me a short while ago about the videos they'd been looking at which show Hamas fighters carrying out public executions.
They are, by their very nature, incredibly graphic. Now, we're not showing you the video, but we can show you a still, and I can describe what happens in the video. Now, this video emerged on Monday, and what we see are a large crowd of people surrounding 8 men who are kneeling and blindfolded with their hands bound behind their back. Then we have armed men who have headbands on that have the Hamas insignia on their heads, and we are hearing jeers and shouts from the crowd. Amongst them, we can hear them saying agent, which can sometimes be translated to collaborator. Now, social media posts on channels are accusing these men who've been executed as collaborators, and what happens is that these 8 men are then instantly killed before there are jeers and shouts of cheering. Now, this is incredibly graphic footage, but it's not alone in that case, because recently we've also verified another incident at the very same place, which is in Gaza City, the very place that the Israeli troops have just pulled out of and moved to the withdrawal line as part of the ceasefire agreement. But we've also seen another incident at that junction where we've just shown you that still. And in that case, we've seen armed fighters pointing their guns at one man who's lying on the ground, who is then shot in the leg.
So is this part of a wider show of strength from Hamas? What are you learning and seeing?
We've also verified other images of, as you said, forces deployed by Hamas who are called essentially internal security forces. Now, we've seen them out in force in Gaza City with their assault rifles, wearing their caps that say the internal security forces, and they're essentially a type of security police for Hamas, but they also carry out other jobs such as tracking informants, for example. But experts have told us that these types of troops and forces deployed are part of Hamas's attempt to reassert control. And before this war, long before that, there were other forces at play too, which are clans. And those are essentially large family networks that are tied because of business or political affiliations. Now, some of them are vying for power in Gaza, and the power that they're trying to get is that the vacuum that the Israeli troops have now left.
Merlin Thomas from BBC Verify. We're going to take a short break. Back with more of today's headline stories in just a moment or two. Around the world and across the UK, you're watching. Welcome back to BBC News. Let's turn to the situation in France, because the French Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu has told Parliament his government will freeze unpopular pension reforms until after the 2027 presidential elections. Well, he made the concession as he set out his budget priorities after a week that saw him resign, only to be reappointed. The changes will raise the retirement age from 62 to 64, which were seen as signature reforms in Emmanuel Macron's presidency.
Our system is imbalanced and we must fix it. So here is this government ready for a new debate around the future of our pension. The response, the answer is yes. A social answer can only be taken if it is fair and just. It's it's a challenge for our future. Our pensioners, our pension and the reform of our pension will be at the heart of the debate of the next presidential election. And this is why we need to ask from now on, working with unions, working with you, it can be an opportunity to move forward.
Well, that was the session in Parliament earlier. Our Paris correspondent Hugh Schofield explained to me a little earlier why the Prime Minister had to back down.
It was the price that had to be paid. As we all know, the country's been going through this terrible political crisis due to the absence of any majority in Parliament. We've seen 3 Prime Ministers come and go. Sebastian Lecornu back. The only way he can get through the next few months will be by buying some kind of deal with the soft left or the sort of centre left, the socialists. And their price was quite clear. We will not back a censure motion on Thursday if you commit publicly in your inaugural speech here to suspending the pension reform. The pension reform was the key reform of President Macron in his second term. It was designed and presented as a way of proving France's credibility to the money markets, that it could reform, that it could take on board the changing demography and ensure the sustainability of its pension system. That meant raising the retirement age to 64, still well below the European average. Well, that's all coming undone now, and that's the price that has to be paid in order to keep political stability. Now, probably the socialists will not vote for bringing the government down on Thursday, so probably the government will survive. But the cost is this, that the pension reform is put on hold. Will it ever come back? Well, I mean, he's putting it back till the presidential election of 2027. But can you imagine any presidential candidate campaigning saying, I'm going to bring back a higher pension age? No, I don't think so. So, I think that reform is dead in the water. Something else will have to be done at some point, but it's a big victory for the left.
And briefly, Hugh, so the government potentially limps on, but what will the markets make of all of that? Because the reason for that change is, of course, the size of the national debt.
Indeed, the government will probably limp on, though the arithmetic here is incredibly tight, and I'm not going to promise you that it'll survive the censure motion on Thursday, because it really is down to a handful of votes one way or the other. But certainly it's been helped by the fact that the socialists probably now will not come out against it. But yes, of course, the bigger message, the one that's going out, is that this big reform, which was supposed to prove France's credit and its seriousness about reform, the hallmark of President Macron's second term, the one big thing he did in his second term, as you said, pushing it through against the fact of massive opposition to it, that he did that saying this has to happen because France needs this. I'm sorry, France needs this. Well, it's now undone, which raises all sorts of questions about the country's credit rating and whether it can ever bring in unless it is really at the gunpoint of the money market some point down the road, whether it really can bring in a change on pension reform.
Hugh Schofield in Paris. Now, the former Education Secretary, Gavin Williamson, has been given evidence today at the COVID inquiry. He's denied that the Education Department's lack of planning was an extraordinary dereliction of duty, but admitted there were failures in understanding the enormity of what a pandemic would actually mean.
There were lots of actions that were being taking place, which we thought were the right actions, but as we look back at it now, we should have had different actions in place in order to be better prepared for it. So I readily accept that there were many mistakes that were made, both pre-start of the pandemic and in those early stages of the pandemic, because I don't think the DFE was any different to the Number 10 or the Cabinet Office or other departments that were leading the way in terms of dealing with that pandemic.
Well, let's go to our education reporter, Vanessa Clark, who's there at the inquiry. And Vanessa, there were some pretty brutal questions there to Gavin Williamson about whether he was to blame or Number 10.
Yeah, and I think this was a running theme throughout the day. There was some interesting clashes that he described between Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister, and Gavin Williamson, who's the former Education Secretary. Those two main talking points when it came to those clashes. The first was January 2021, when it was decided that schools would reopen back up. Now, Gavin Williamson said that actually those closures were unnecessary and it was in children's interests to actually open back up. Boris Johnson, a very different view, saying that it was important that schools closed. And basically what Gavin Williamson said was, I think Boris Johnson chose the NHS over children. I felt that the consequences for children weren't properly taken into account. So interesting that they had such a difference of opinion, and actually the inquiry was shown in an email sent by Gavin Williamson to Boris Johnson with some flowery language that I can't really read out here, but it just shows the anger and the frustration that was, present at the time. The second clash was in May, when they were hoping to phase back in students in 2020. And again, Boris Johnson wanted to give a press conference, reassuring parents that schools would open. Gavin Williamson was really annoyed that this would happen and said, actually, if we do that, we'll be breaking the law because they can't social distance in class. So he said Boris Johnson was giving students a false hope. So you can see there just the tensions that were happening around that time.
A twin question, because he was asked a lot of times questions around school closures. Did they actually have a plan? So his answers to that, and also, of course, it led on to, later on in the timeline, to the whole exams fiasco, and he was asked questions about that as well, wasn't he?
He was, yeah. So when it comes to school closures, throughout the last 2 weeks, we have heard consistently that teachers have said there was no plan in place. They were trying to make a plan